That's on. Joe Jack, do you want to introduce yourself first and give a bit of a background, and then I'll go after that.
Yeah, sure. So hello everybody. So my name is Joe Jack Williams, or Joe Williams occasionally. I'm head of sustainability at Bywater Properties. And until end of last year, I was head of sustainability at Fairclough Bradley Studios. So I used to be a mechanical engineer. Those things are in the past now, and that's slowly morphed to sustainability and health and well-being and this kind of side to it. So um, and I've written books on energy and carbon and bits and pieces. So I'm really kind of a big picture person. I'm into the kind of holistic side of it. So really great to be here. Really looking forward to a good chat with Ollie because I know we've got some great thoughts kicking around. So Ollie,
Thanks, Joe Jack. So I'm Ollie Lowry. I'm the director of Ackroyd Lowry Architects. My career, I suppose, started 20 years ago working for Archetype, who are kind of passive house pioneers. I suppose they were kind of one of the first practices to really bring passive house to the UK. But before that, they were very much like timber framers. So they actually, Archetype came out of Walter Thiegel and the kind of self-build movement, and it was always about timber frame. And so I spent the first 10 years of my career like learning passive house timber detailing to the extent that when I started my own practice 10 years later, the first project I worked on where they were like, we'll just do that, standard out of masonry cavity wall. I was like, masonry cavity wall. And I then had to kind of like relearn how to detail buildings in the normal way. I'd never knew that that was what normal was. And so now, 10 years later, so I've been running AL for 10 years. I think the way that I learned originally was much better, but it's not the normal way. And so now I'm on like a bit of a, I suppose, mission and, like alongside many others, Joe Jack included, to try and make timber or like bio-based materials more the normal. And there's lots of reasons to want to do that, but like one of them is that I just love working with timber. I think it's great material. Make a mistake, doesn't not the end of the world, whereas I've had to call out the diamond drill machine on occasion, having got things wrong on a concrete building, and that's much more expensive than just sawing something. So um, we are actually working with Bywater on a project which I think is really exciting. They're such an amazing client, and it would probably, Joe Jack, be worth talking about some of the background of Bywater as well.
yeah,
And
absolutely. Yeah, I mean it's interesting. Ollie, you talked about the wonders of timber. So at Bywater Properties, we're a timber-led developer. So all of our properties have a timber presumption. When we're investing in them, we want them to be able to be built out of timber. And part of this is because, as Ollie said, it's a great material, and we can probably talk through some of those key bits actually. From my point of view, it's really sustainable. It's a renewable material. It locks away carbon. It's just fantastic. But also, we're backed by Sumitomo Forestry, a Japanese forestry company. We obviously just want everybody to use timber because they recognize the kind of benefits of using a bio-based product. And I think there's that interesting thing about alternatives to timber. We talk about CLT and we talk about glulam. Well, the alternatives are, holes in the ground, carbon intensive materials, steel and concrete. And they've got amazing decarbonisation plans, but they're off in the future. And this is all about embodied carbon. And I think Ollie, sort of briefing note we were chatting earlier about, embodied carbon is the carbon that's emitted now. I think that's a really important to recognise. So taking that carbon out of the atmosphere, locking it away in a building, is a really good way to do it. So yeah, I think there's plenty of reasons to do it, but for Bywater, there's multiple ways. But Ollie, I'm kind of interested about why you found it so much easier to work with timber compared to the materials. Are there specific bits or
well, I think I mean it might be worth saying the things that aren't easy with timber because there are definitely some challenges, particularly now. So Archetype were fortunate, I suppose, to have a lot of schools and a lot of like 2 and 3 story buildings. And there, it's much easier to use timber than it is on residential buildings and buildings over 11 and 18 meters, which is now typically the type of projects that we work on. So fire is obviously one of the challenges with timber. In the wake of Grenfell, regular Part B regulation 7(2) started at 18 meters. So buildings above 18 meters, you cannot have combustible elements in the external wall buildup, and it was then reduced to 11 meters, which means that if you're using timber in a building above 11 meters, which is not particularly tall, really, then you can't use it in the external wall at all. And that means that you're then having to do sort of gymnastics where your structure has to be kind of inbound. So all your internal joists and your internal stud walls can be timber, and then you have to have a kind of external frame depending on the shape of the building, and then your walls outside of that with like metal frame, or there's different ways you can do it, but not timber, and that is a bit of a headache. There's also, I think, a less well-known problem with timber, which and it's not a problem. I love timber, but it's not very good acoustically. So again, for
Yeah, yeah.
residential, there are some challenges with like your walls build-ups being quite thick, and your joists having to have quite a lot of boarding on it. But just, I mean, sorry, that was all the bad things. But the good thing about timber, like, I think from my perspective, there's too much emphasis. I think architects use operational energy to make themselves feel good. Like we're in an industry that is really carbon intensive. It's really bad at emitting lots of carbon, and so we focus on the operational because we can tell ourselves, oh, we're really ramping that down. But as soon as you start looking at doing that really well, like all the way to passive house, then your body becomes even more important as a proportion of the whole life carbon. So why do I love working in timber? One, it's forgiving. Two, you can prefabricate. And three, it is probably the easiest way to reduce that embodied carbon, which becomes so much more important as we reduce our operational.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. Just to finish on that note, the one of the things in the net zero carbon building standard is we don't talk about whole life carbon. We talk about body carbon. We talk about operational energy because there's a conflict between the two. Yeah, it's this kind of idea that, and you're right. We've been thinking, and it's not just architecture. It's the industry's been thinking about operational energy for a long time. When I started, 2005, the way I paid my way through the rest of my university degree was doing Part L calculations because they were so new, and SBEM had just come in and SAP had just come in, and it was great, easy money back then. But we've got a history of thinking about energy. I don't think we've ever really got to grips with it. I don't think we've really understood it. If you look at buildings, we're still struggling to get buildings down to passive house standards. Not really great at building. I think as an industry, we can be really patchy, and I don't think we've ever had that focus and that kind of diligence that comes with it. What's interesting when we start to move away and talk about body carbon is these are things which are much easier to deal with. We can just put less stuff in the building. That's really easy. We can start to use better materials and products. Those are easier wins. We can design stuff to standard sheet sizes. Those are easier wins. And actually, we don't need to worry so much about build quality and that kind of side to it. As designers, we can control those underlying principles far easier. The reason the net zero carbon building standard splits them out between operational energy and embodied carbon is because in order for our grid to decarbonize, we really need to reduce the amount of energy our buildings use. We just don't have enough renewables forecast in our national grid. So what we're looking for is a way of driving it down without having those kind of unintended consequences of burping loads of embodied carbon out. So that's what we have, those two metrics. And when you start to get to whole life carbon, actually it becomes really complex because you're trying to convert operational energy into carbon. But if we use it like a decarbonized grid approach, then we have problems there because actually it devalues the importance of energy. So yeah, Ollie, you've kind of hit on a lot of these things. One of the roles of designers is balancing these things. It's not just about energy and carbon, it's about acoustics, finding the right material for the right place, and how do you make those things work. And you're absolutely right. If you start a building which is looking concrete, or you start applying systems to the wrong kind of building, actually it can be really problematic. As those interfaces of systems is actually where we find the biggest risk in terms of building performance.
And I also think it's interesting. So, like, both matter, right? Operational and embodied matter, and I think that will be different building by building. So, the example I did a podcast recently with Kelly Alvarez Doran, who made the point that if you're talking about a lab, the amount of air changes per hour and the amount of servicing that goes into a laboratory means that really you should be looking at the operational first, because that operational is likely to, in the long term, always outweigh the embodied, whereas residential is like almost the opposite. Um, and
Yeah.
so you have to have this, but like it's not an either or. You know, and you have to look at both. And I don't think at the moment, like I am not the type of person who wants more legislation. I think there's already plenty of that to go around. So I'm like a sustainable libertarian. I want to come up with ways that we can be incentivized rather than forced into using in like should whole life carbon assessments or whole life energy assessments be done on buildings? A lot of ours they are now done. It's not, doing the assessment is one thing and then reacting to it is another. But I think
But
there should be an incentivization for developers to use bio-based or low embodied carbon materials rather than a stick, use a carrot.
yeah, one of the things that holds us back, I sort of agree. Extra regulation is extra pain in the arse one way or another, isn't it? But the flip side to that is because there's no consistency in calculation. So if you look at something like Part L, now I really dislike SBEM and SAPCalc because I don't think they're accurate. And actually, one of the worst things they could have done is put an energy figure in there. It wasn't what it was designed for, but it gave a consistency that we could all work towards. And I think this is what's missing in embodied carbon. If I pick up an embodied carbon report from somebody and it's done by BREEAM, great, but it's not comparable to one that aligns with RICS standard, or it's not comparable with one that's done to the LETI approach and all these kind of things. And actually, it means decision making is incredibly complex, and it gives us a kind of perverse kind of view of where those targets are. So actually, for me, legislation is not so much about having a kind of limit or a target. It's about consistency of methodology. So we all know how to do it. I mean, I would say um, one of the big problems with sustainability generally is that it's not seen as a kind of design activity. It's seen as consultancy. It's about report writing. And that is my biggest frustration. Nothing annoys me more when I sit in a project meeting and somebody gives me a sustainability report that says our building's achieved an X, Y, Z, or 200, or 80 stars, or 1 star, and that's it. I'm not interested in that. What does it mean for the design process? What does it mean for our building? How do I improve on that? Or am I already doing really well? That's what I'm in for. I'm not interested in the report at the end. I'm interested in physical outcomes that I can measure. And I think that's one of the things that's constantly missing.
But I'm guessing, or from what we were told before the call, this audience is like architects, or certainly some of them. I can see there's some
Mm,
architects.
yeah.
Um, how do you, Joe Jack, now that you've been an architect and now you're a developer, or you work for an
Mhm.
architect, you now work for a developer. For all the architects on this call, and this is a question that I have to ask myself, how do we? What's the best argument for us to use to convince our developer clients that using natural, sustainable, or like whatever low carbon materials is better than using the standard in more carbon intensive materials? I'd be interested in your thoughts on like how you make the argument.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the argument, I mean, I'm in a lovely position in some ways. The argument's already been made for me within Bywater.
Yeah.
So the argument here is, um, and it's slightly been eroded by events across the pond, is that when we start to think about our own carbon footprint, we talk about the UK carbon footprint, what we have is a decarbonisation pathway that we have to follow. And really, we want to be part of that solution. And there is financing, there is money available to it, which is slightly disappearing away. But there's no right answer for different sectors. So, for instance, if we're thinking about office buildings, it's a very different approach to how we talk about sustainability than it is for, um, buy to rent housing or even co-living. So, co-living housing or student resi, the focus there is all about operational energy. That's where it is. Offices, kind of similar. Whereas if it's places for sale, maybe it's housing, actually it's an easier win because they take the ownership of the embodied carbon. So there's no simple answer. What I've started doing, which I think is probably sort of in its infancy, is talking about global temperature change associated with carbon. What I find with carbon is it's too airy fairy, and I know years of trying to get people to understand it. We did when I was at FCB, we did an amazing exhibition, which was we made totems the size of a kilogram of CO2. So a kilogram of CO2 is about 570 liters in atmospheric pressure, and we put all these little discs and of material in there. So we had little bits of steel and copper and concrete and brick and timber and whatever else. They all emitted 1 kilogram of CO2. People still can't visualize it, still can't understand it. So actually drifting away and taking that step back and saying, it's not about the CO2. I'm kind of not interested in how much CO2. What I'm interested in is global warming and climate change and taking that step. What we do see is where we're trying to find investors, providing it in a way that's a positive step. We don't want to provide issues where we say, well, it's 10% more expensive than concrete, or it's 8% more expensive than steel and concrete. Steel and concrete shouldn't be on the table. Take it off the table, go with bio-based, and then you don't have that discussion about, oh, we could save some money. Not saving money, it's just deferring money into our kind of environmental impacts. So there's a couple of ways to unpick it, and there's no simple answer, unfortunately.
Can I give you mine? Because I have to
Go on.
obviously try quite a lot. Don't always succeed. Well, I mean, the first one is from a planning perspective. Like, ultimately, development is like winning an Olympic medal. Development is a game of marginal gains, and at every stage of the value creation of a property, there's the opportunity to either make a margin, make a 1% gain or lose it. And if you mess up enough of these little marginal gains, then you won't make money on your project. That's, who do you use for your financing? What you get at planning is the greatest, the gatekeepers of value in the property creation chain are the planners, right? That is a reasonably bold statement, but like
Yeah.
I believe it to be true, and that's why we at Craig Larry spend a lot of time and money um, trying to build relationships with the planners, not so that we can influence them, but so that we can understand them. And most local authorities in London have they've declared a climate emergency. Great, let's use that. That means all the planners should be aligned to the fact that there is a climate emergency. So how can we convince a developer client to use to commit to something? Well, you can do it through the planning system to an extent because actually the structure of the building it can be changed without going back to planning. But if you can try and lock stuff in, commitments to operational and also you know saying that you're going to be using bio-based materials, and then particularly if it's a major application in London, it has to have whole life carbon assessment in any case. Um, Trying to lock in some of this stuff at planning so that you are using that benefit and saying to the planners, look, we are committed to this, and therefore will you allow us things in return, more square footage, more height, whatever it is that you need to try and make to optimize the scheme. So that's I think an argument that I have found useful. And
Yeah.
you at the end of the day, really the easiest thing when you're trying to convince a client is to demonstrate an ROI. There's a new interesting thing, well, it's not an interesting thing. There's green finance products as well, and that
Mm.
you said that you think the flow of capital is diminishing. There is an argument that it might be increasing because of people seeking new homes for ESG money. I don't know if this is true, but I do know a product
It's
that Ingenious have just brought out, which they use construction carbon as the monitoring sort of mechanism, and they will give you a rebate of 1% on your loan at the end of the project if you can hit what you've committed to in terms of the embodied.
what,
Sorry, it's whole life, so embodied and operational.
yeah. What we're seeing, Ollie, is you're right. There's some great new products out there. Genius is one of them. Talking about actually how do you incentivize it, but what we're going to see is rather than there being a homogenous group like there was last year of kind of ESG and there's kind of outliers on it, what we're getting is sustainability, and it's a much smaller pot, and everybody else is slowly withdrawing away. So there's opportunities, but they're in a smaller pot than the other big. If we talk to like BlackRock, for instance, who finance loads of stuff, they had specific ESG things, and that's gone overnight.
Mm.
So yes and no. So the other people who have a real value in this is agents, and for offices that's leasing agents. For kind of build to rent, it's also leasing agents or estate agents, whatever that is. what we've got to try and do is tell them that people will be prepared to pay more for this one way or another. And whether that's, or we manage to get it rented quicker if it's an office, or we get it leased quicker if it's somewhere else. So what we're trying to work out is what are those kind of co-benefits that come with the sustainable building. So if you look at Paradise Building, so it's an office building down in Lambeth, which is finished. It's despite the fact it's only 10 minutes away from Houses of Parliament, it's on the wrong side of the river, so it's seen as kind of, oh, it's in the wilderness, it may as well be in Surrey or something. But actually, it's really well located. But to get people to think about going to Paradise rather than just any other office building, it's got amazing sustainability credentials. So it's 415 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared for upfront carbon. It's full of timber and the timber's exposed, so it creates a really beautiful atmosphere. And the reason is A, because we care about sustainability carbon, but B, we also need to pull people into that building, that property. And it's that market driver. So yeah, planning, absolutely. It's a really key barrier and a key way into it. The next bit is kind of leasing agents and how we get that kind of realization through.
And how do you articulate the sort of maybe this is getting too granular, but like a lot of office, well, because a lot of office buildings say that they are top prime, BREEAM outstanding, net zero. Like I was just cycling across Tower Bridge and this morning, and there's a building there going up, and it says all of those things, and it's all, it doesn't look, it looks nice, but it's like there's no way the embodied
Yeah,
carbon has been included into that because it's all made out of brick and concrete frame. I saw it go up, and like it's just a standard building, it looks nice but it's not doing anything that any other
it,
office building isn't doing. So
it
how do
it's
you articulate that you are doing stuff that is way above what other people are doing?
so one of the things that we're doing, and this is the big issue because what I can't do is go into the leasing agents and say, our building's really zero carbon. These other buildings are zero carbon. Well, that's not true because we've got to keep them on side. And this is, it's a key bit. It's all about collaboration. This is what sustainability is really about. It's about getting people together and pushing it forward. So what we're doing with the agents is educating them about carbon. I'm taking them through the numbers, getting them to understand what embodied carbon is, what operational energy is, actually what these figures mean, what the kind of benchmarks are. So work with Leti, for instance, we changed the benchmarks from the Leti embodied carbon primer. There was just kind of simple numbers. And then in 2021, we redid it. So there's an A to G rating system. So working with a few others. The reason being is that provides a scale that the agents can then use, but also that people can feel a bit more empowered. What was happening is people weren't hitting the 500 or 400 or whatever the number might well be, feeling despondent and then just kind of giving up on the rest of it.
Mm.
Whereas now we've got these kind of endless incremental little steps where it's like, well, I'm just on a D, but I could, with a bit of extra work, get onto a C. Great. There's an incremental step. And then we can chain it up. So yeah, it's educating them. It really is just spending time talking to them. And what's interesting is the agents have been lapping it up. They're really, really enthused with this. I think there's probably a bit of soul searching to say, as you mentioned about certain buildings that have these amazing credibility, these claims, then they're carbon neutral or whatever else. That's just not the case.
Well, that Bloomberg building in Bank, which is
Yeah,
beautiful, which is Foster's, and that was the first net zero office building in the UK. Like most of the facades covered in aluminium, and aluminium is like pretty much the single worst material that you could specify as an architect
yeah.
in terms of embodied carbon.
In fact, yeah, and the other bits are stone, which was locally sourced, fantastic.
Yeah,
But then
stone's probably not that bad
but
actually.
but they shipped it to Italy to be processed and shipped it back.
I still think
So
that's kind of okay. Like shipping a bit of
like
stone, I think I'm
it,
okay with
it,
that in the
it's
grand scheme.
well weirdly no. So one of the things with stone is it's very heavy, it's dense. So actually, it's the same problem when you use things like bio-based, like mass timber.
Mm.
When we use stuff like concrete and brick in the UK, concrete in particular, it travels a couple of hours tops to your site. So the A4 emissions tend to be pretty negligible. When you look at something that's inherently low carbon, like stone or timber, the transport distances really rack up. And because we have to transport them long distances and they're big, heavy stuff, actually you can really very quickly dwarf some of those savings. With CLT, it tends to stack up and it's fine. Um, if you're shipping your stone, and it's really dependent on the mode of transport. So if you were shipping stone to our site from China, say, rather than from the home counties, actually the carbon probably wouldn't be, it'd probably be much better from the home counties. China's not so bad. If I was shipping my stone from, certainly from Italy, I was taken on the back of lorries rather than on a cargo ship, the stone from China would be lower carbon.
Interesting. Yes, when you said shipping, I had a ship in mind, but actually it probably wasn't. It was a truck.
And this is the problem with timber from, it's not a problem. It's just one of the things to be conscious of. When we take mass timber from Europe, typically Austria and Germany, it's typically coming by lorries. And actually, UK lorries and European lorries are pretty good lorries compared to, say, the States. So, it's a significant amount, but compared to the concrete that would be, we'd use otherwise, and that emissions that would cause tends to be much lower for timber. If you look at somewhere like America, and if you're shipping timber around America, that is hugely problematic because their lorries are far less efficient, and it's exactly the same in Australia. So it's really interesting. You necessarily need to get into the weeds on these things because as an
Mm.
industry, we don't have that intuition about what's low carbon. Whereas for operational energy, I think in some ways we probably do. It's a bit more intuitive.
I think there's been a lot of education on it, and I think that education on the side of embodied is still in progress, right? I think architects have become pretty well versed in operational. The embodied is when I was at Archetype, my very good friend Gareth Selby was trying to do this embodied carbon calculator for every material ever, and it was amazing. And he got to the end of Excel. I didn't even know there was an end, but he reached the end of Excel trying to do it, and he was like, it became a bit like in The Beautiful Mind, where Russell Crowe's in that shed with all the pieces of string, and he got like. It was so complicated, and you can't even find out the data for stuff that's shipped from China as to what's happened. You know,
Yeah.
what electricity did they use in the processes, and where was that electricity generated? It's like you're never going to find that answer out, so you just have to make some assumptions. But how how could architects begin to be better at being more literate in embodied? You know, I'm speaking to you, I realize I know nothing other than I think timber's good. You know, but like even within that, like CLT probably has some things that are worse than stick build.
Well, actually, CLT, for instance, is very good compared to steel and concrete, but compared to a stick built system, it's still pretty high, right? And I think that the key thing here is, um, so in Leti we have a kind of motto within Leti, which is kind of be humble, ask questions. You're not going to know everything, right? So that needs to sort of start percolating through. And I think people have got to realize that actually that they're not going to be experts on these things and they need to ask these questions. That's the first thing. I think ask them. And if you can't find the answers, keep asking until you find them. If you can't find them, there's a PhD in it for somebody somewhere, um, which is kind of what it is. So the reason I can do embodied carbon is because at FCB, we've been thinking about carbon since the 90s, embodied carbon since the 90s. We've also funded a PhD in whole life carbon in 2010. So, that's how we got up to speed. And, I gave a talk to the Royal Institute of Irish Architects last Friday, in fact, teaching them how to read an EPD. What I'd say is go find some data, look at it. Embodied carbon is mostly very straightforward. It's simply multiplying bits and pieces together. But actually, it's just adding, it's multiplication. It's just simple
Mm.
tables. Um, there's lots of good stuff out there. The RICS, if you don't know a number, RICS guide, whole life carbon will give you a good start at it. I'd obviously recommend FCBS Carbon, which is a free spreadsheet tool that FCB developed, self particularly, which next Tuesday, for instance, I'm going to University of Athens to teach them on. But I think just have a go at it. If I don't know, I mean, Oliver, a question for you. How did you get stuck into it? Where did you start?
Well, I'm I had the learning of archetype, but now on a building, I don't, I'm a bit more like that because I think there's only so much agency that we have. So, for example, when it comes to something like, so I used to describe it as the gilt-proof membrane. We used to design these amazing timber passive houses that sat on these big rough foundations. Like if you happen to just be over like chalky ground or clay or whatever, your foundations would just get bigger and bigger and bigger. You're like, well, don't worry about that. That's below the gilt-proof membrane. Um, and Yeah, so I think even though I had all the benefit of the learning archetype, that every building has some bits where there's very little that you can do. And I think, in those cases, it's like, what are your processes? Well, rather than looking at the tracking of the different materials that I'm specifying, it's like specifying, sorry. Um, if it's an HRB, for instance, and I'm going to be using non-combustible materials, it's like, how do I reduce the grid? Probably the most significant impact there is getting the grid right. So it's like, how do you make those simple? How do you reduce the loading of the building so you can make the foundation smaller? How do you make the grid like optimized so that the slab could be thinner, or whatever? Like doing working with engineers that understand that, I think, can make a greater impact than what I specify in terms of the actual finishes or whatever, because that's going to not move the dial quite as much.
It,
Um, I wonder if you could give some top tips to the architects on the call of like, what are the things that you think, what are the three worst things that you can do, and what are the three best things that you can do from your
my top
years
three.
yeah, exactly. Top three and bottom
Do,
three.
do, 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 do,
Like
do.
aluminium cladding's
Um,
got to be up there with the worst things that you can do.
no, so
No?
but it's a really interesting point, and this is where it comes back to intuition. Um, I'd so aluminium cladding. Okay, the aluminium itself is very high carbon, but it tends to be pretty thin. It's
Mm,
1.5 to 3 mil thick, right? Whereas the stainless steel brackets that hold up the system, or those aluminium brackets, right, those kind of things, will have way more embodied carbon than the actual aluminium. So first thing to think about is, can you reduce the weight of your rain screen cladding if you've got rain screen cladding, or can you avoid having any system that holds it back off the end of the slab? So at Old Paradise Street, for instance, we've got this amazing ceramic cladding. The ceramic cladding is there because it's next to a railway line and brake dust is horribly nasty. You need some way of self-cleaning, so the rain can just wash it off. It's great. But 80%, and the ceramic cladding is pretty hefty, 80% of the embodied carbon of that is in the stainless steel framing that sits behind it and holds it up. I mean, it's huge. So really kind of a tricky bit. The other thing I mean, the biggest thing is work with your structural engineers. That's the absolute first thing. Get your structures dialed in, nailed, efficient. iStructure got some great guidance on there. There's a brilliant guide by the Bureau Happold team on kind of grid sizes. So without doing anything, any changes to the building form, if you change your grid size from 9 meters to 6.5, you can save about 40% of your embodied carbon of your building. Just your structure. There's no material replacements. There's no complexity of using bio-based materials or any of those kind of other bits that come with it. In fact, if you get down to 6.5 meters, you could use bio-based materials. You could use timber and glue them. Third thing, raised access floors, absolute bugbear of mine. They're just the worst thing. They're about 40 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared. Letty, just to put this in perspective, so Old Paradise Street, the building in Lambeth, it's about 400 kilograms of CO2. I say 415, I think I said earlier. So about 10% of that body carbon is just the raised access floor. Design it out if you can. I mean, that's the big thing. Agents hate it, or use reclaimed ones. Reclaimed ones tend to be a bit more expensive. So, yeah, those are my top three big hitters. Get your structure right. Think about reducing the steel framing system for your facade. If you can, get rid of raised access floors. Absolutely the devil's work. Necessary, unfortunately. Yeah, I don't know. Does that sort of align with what you're seeing, Ollie? Or
yeah, no, I think that's really useful. I'm glad I got the grid one right. Um, we have got 7 minutes left or something like that.
yeah,
So what we were going to talk about some bigger ideas. I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about retrofit as well, because like, I mean, that's the most obvious thing. That's somebody's already committed that carbon, so it's good to use that.
yeah, yeah. So where would you start in terms of retrofit? How are you getting on with delivering that? It feels to me it's almost a slightly different skill set working on existing building.
Yeah, I really like it. My business partner John is like, he's really committed to it. He's got, very much like a specialist of it, and has done it his whole career. And I think probably whatever 20 years ago when we started, it was just people didn't really, it was just refurbishing, right? That's just what people did. Now it's got its own thing. It's retrofit because it's sexy. I think it's interesting when I talk to like people across the industry about whether there's a huge benefit in terms of like the lease up rates for a good retrofit office building. I think it's got to be done really well.
Mm.
So I think that's when you're talking about commercial. I think knock down and rebuild. If you're looking for prime offices, knock down rebuild is always going to be easier to get that prime. I think it's hard to do like a deep retrofit where you spent a lot of money and then get that money back. So I think like with office, actually, kind of doing almost like just looking at where you can really make the biggest impact. Uh, like, can you keep the ductwork? Because the ductwork is like a massive bit of embodied energy, but like replace what feeds into it. So you're trying to kind of save money rather than spend loads of money that you might never get back. Um, when it comes to resi, I think there's challenges, but so we've just got consent for the retrofit of Camberwell Magistrates Court. And there's challenges in all buildings, but this one, because it was a magistrates court, had very, very deep plans, and in trying to get residential to work, there was quite challenging because there's obviously lots of kind of dark spaces in the middle. And we were fortunate that the client actually owned a hotel brand that could occupy some of those less lit spaces, which kind of made the viability of the project stack. So there's different challenges, and the other thing, that's the high risk building. So putting that through the gateways, there's going to be challenges there because again, new build is just easier because like a lot of the gateways now is really about structure, and so it's easy to say, here's my bending schedule and here's my structural calculations. When dealing with an existing structure, I think the retrofit projects are the ones that are taking the longest to go through the gateways, is the feedback that I've got. So there's definitely different challenges around retrofit, but for me, like as an architect, looking at a blank piece of paper is one of the more scary things. I like working with stuff that's already there and like getting my
I,
prompts and things. So
I,
retrofit's exciting
I'm
because you're
absolutely,
being told the answer, or you're being encouraged towards answers.
absolutely. I'm so with you, Ollie. I much prefer having a set of firm constraints that I have to work within, and then I can find the ways to deal with them. And that blank piece of paper is yeah, terrifying, terrifying. It's my inner engineer. I like a resolved system. But I do think it's interesting. And are you getting much from that kind of embodied carbon operational energy kind of flex? I'm just thinking with existing buildings, obviously, it's always a temptation to put, an opportunity to put wall insulation in or upgrade the windows. And how are you getting on with that?
Yeah, well, Camberwell's definitely, we're going all the way back to the concrete frame on that. It's not in a great state. So it's a 1970s building. Um, and the biggest thing we can do there is save the carbon from the frame. Um, After that, there's not a huge amount that we can salvage. But yeah, I mean, there's different levels. For office, we would definitely try and save more. I think if you're changing from office to resi and you're an HRB, you're pretty much going to be stripping it all back and starting again because
Yeah.
they're not going to meet the specification to go through the gateways. Um, but yeah, it's definitely got different, and some challenges are the same, some are different.
Well, this is it. One of the things with retrofit is, you end up in this whole world of sort of understanding moisture movement and understanding the complexities of existing buildings. Particularly if you've got a building that's, even just 50 years old. What's happened to it when things have been scraped out? Have they been taken away or have been put back in? We looked at an office building that was a kind of art studio in Sheffield, and they took some of the heating system off to explore what's in the wall, and they found a whole new heating system behind the wall. And they just put a wall over the top of it, put another one on top. That kind of scale of stuff is there, and you don't know what could be. Oh, I'll take this off, and you all of a sudden, is it a steel frame or but there could be anything in there. So all of that upfront work to get certainty or reduce that risk that comes in those future bits. So understanding moisture movement, build ups of materials, all those kind of things, it just becomes really important. And I think from a procurement and client side, I don't think we necessarily bargain for how much money we have to spend up front just to get the building to a reasonable design, but deal with that
Mm.
risk.
Um, Awesome. We were going to do sort of future predictions, but we've only got a couple of minutes. So my one is that self-driving cars change the urban landscape, and I think I'm looking forward to it. Because if everybody owns just, like Uber, but without a driver and everybody has one, it doesn't need to park in your house. It doesn't need to park outside your house. It doesn't need to park in the street. It can just go and park itself in wherever, some charging station outside of London when it needs to change, and then drives around, picks up some people. If that becomes the norm in 50 years, which it seems mad, but I think change happens quite slow and then quite fast. And I think, as soon as self-driving cars become licensed, I think the idea of individual car ownership will start to diminish. Give it a couple of generations. Why would you bother? So if that's the case, what impact does that have on London or, any city? There's
Yeah.
30 square kilometers of parking spaces in London, 6 times the size of Hyde Park. Imagine making six new parks in London, but they're all along the side of streets and outside of supermarkets. It's going to be, there's a real exciting opportunity for me of how we live in cities, and that stuff is the stuff that I think architects should be engaging with. Like, what do we want our future to look like?
I I I think there's loads of really good stuff to unpick there, and so I can't do it in a minute. But I think the thing I really like, you bring your creativity to a bigger problem and a systemic problem, and that kind of systems thinking, I think is where it all sits, seeing things in the whole. So sort of going, well, actually, car parking's a pain. Is it going to be there? What's going to happen? What are those trends? Or taking those trends to logical conclusions. It's going to be really exciting.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I'm not the presenter though, so there we go. Yeah, it's time is
There
back.
you go.
Sorry to take myself off mute. Yeah, fantastic. Cheers, guys. What I would say is that this sort of typifies the sort of chat that we like on Meshwork, because I suppose in Ollie's own words, he's not the font of all knowledge when it comes to embodied carbon, but he's clearly passionate and represents a lot of architects and where people are thinking at the moment. And Joe Jack Williams clearly is the font of all knowledge, and we're sort of learning from him. But it just goes to show the sort of scale of the challenge ahead. But it's some really interesting things there that were discussed, and also this chat deserves a bigger platform. So I will share it on Meshwork and YouTube. So please everyone else share it when you see it on LinkedIn, because I think it was really interesting, and it typifies the type of chat that all architects and consultants and installers are having, and it represents it really well. So really appreciate you taking the time and to be with us today. And I know you're already late for your next meeting, so I'll say goodbye. But yeah, thanks
Excellent.
everyone else.
Thanks
Cheers.
so much for having us. And if anybody wants to get in
Thanks.
touch, just I'm on LinkedIn lots, so just message or connect and then message me, and then I'm happy to have a chat with people. Nice to present to you. Thanks very
Yeah.
much, Simon. That was
Yeah.
really good.
Yeah,
Cool.
thanks,
And cheers,
Ollie.
Joe.
Thanks all.
Cheers, Joe Jack. Thanks.
Cheers, Ollie. Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye.